tutorial, I'm showing you how to cover your cake in fondant using the paneling method. Now, this method is slightly different to laying one piece of fondant over the top of your cake and smoothing it on. This requires you to add the fondant in two pieces. So you add the top and the side separately. There are so many advantages to this method. Maybe when you're laying the fondant over the top, you usually find that your fondant tears, you may get elephant skin, or if you really struggle to get those sharp edges. Also, this method is great if you're trying to cover a really tall double barrel cake. Now, there is one small disadvantage which I will mention before we jump in, and that is you will get a really faint slight join on the top. You'll also get a really faint seam on the back, but we can work on the cake to make these as minimal as possible. Now, when I refer to fondant, this also means sugar paste and rollable icing. These are all exactly the same things, they're just called different things in different places. Okay, let's get started. One of the most important parts when covering your cakes in fondant is actually preparing your cakes ready. So in order to prepare your cake, the tools that you're going to need is, first of all, I've got my turntable and I've just placed down a small piece of non-slip mat with an acrylic board on the top. Or in some of my other videos, you may have seen me just use a glass board. Or you could even use a cake drum just to prepare your cake on. I've then got my small offset spatula, a smoothing tool for around the side of my cake, and you can either use a metal one or I've got an acrylic one here, and they'll both work exactly the same. I've got a small piece of parchment paper and a really small spirit level. For my cake, I've got two 5-inch sponge cakes. I'm going to be filling and covering these in chocolate ganache. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is level my cakes just to get rid of that dome. And there are a few reasons why I do this. By taking off that dome on the top, it makes it easier to stack your cakes. It also makes it a lot easier to get a nice flat top on the top of your cakes. You also get a nice even layer of ganache or buttercream through your cakes, as you don't have these big pockets to fill at the sides. This makes it look a lot nicer when you cut into your cake. So the first thing I'm going to do is just use a serrated bread knife and I'm going to run around the top. You can then divide your cakes into different layers if you wish. I've then created a batch of milk chocolate ganache. You could also use white chocolate or dark chocolate ganache. Now, alternatively, you could use buttercream and it would work in exactly the same way. One thing that I love about using ganache under a fondant covered cake is it firms up a little bit more than buttercream. So it means that you can apply a little bit more pressure to the cake when you're covering it. Now, if you wanted to fill the center of your cake with something a lot softer like jam or caramel, you want to stop this running out. So instead of just applying it onto the layer like I am, you could pop that ganache or buttercream into a piping bag and just create a ring around the side, which is going to create a dam to stop that soft center from oozing out. So I'm actually going to take a small piece of parchment paper, place that on top, and just use my small spirit level and just make sure that my cake is sitting level, as at this stage we can just push on that top. Now we're going to start with a crumb coat around the outside, and this is just a thin layer of buttercream or ganache that just locks in any loose crumbs. It also allows you to fill any gaps and make sure your cake has straight sides before we add our final layer. So I'm just going to use my offset spatula, just running around my cake, just picking up any of that excess ganache spilling out the edge, just working this around, filling any gaps. I'm then going to run around the edge of my cake with my smoothing tool. So I'm just using the acrylic one. And the most important thing is you want to make sure that you're keeping the bottom edge of your scraper against your board. This is really going to help you get that 90-degree angle and stop you angling the top or the bottom of your cake inwards. So I'm just working my way around, and at this point making sure that I've got that right angle. Now with the crumb coat, don't worry if you can see some of that cake through it. It's going to resemble a bit of a semi-naked cake. Now, if you've ever covered your cake in fondant and you found that you've got little bulges on the side, this could be that you've put too much filling in the center of your cake. I'm then going to take my offset spatula and just on the top, start from the outside and just pull that ganache into the center, just to get a nice edge around the top. Now the crumb coat doesn't need to be perfect, but as you can see, we're starting to get nice straight sides and a nice straight top, which is going to give us a great base for our fondant. So I'm going to pop this in the fridge for around 15 to 30 minutes, just until that ganache has fully firmed up, so I can add the next layer of ganache before we add our fondant. Now, if you're new to covering your cakes in a fondant and you do want to give the other method a try, where you cover your cake in one piece of fondant, then I do actually have another tutorial which I will put a link to on the screen and in the description below, so you can check that out. Once that ganache has firmed up, I'm going to add the final layer around the outside, and I'm just going to start on the top. So I want to get this as smooth as possible, and I can then go in and add that ganache around the side of my cake. I want this to be around 3 to 5 millimeters in thickness, depending on your preference. And again, you want to keep that scraper against your board. And one thing to remember is to take your time. Sometimes when you see sped up videos on the internet, it looks like the person's just run around the cake once and you've got nice smooth sides. It always takes a bit of time just to run that scraper around, fill any gaps and smooth out any of those air bubbles. And it's always a lot easier to get a smooth fondant finish when the ganache or buttercream underneath is nice and smooth. I'm then going to go in again on the top, just pulling from that outside edge into the center. And once you're happy with how that's looking, I'm then going to pop this in the fridge so it completely firms up, so we can cover it in our panelled fondant. So first of all, I've got this ball of pink fondant, and I do find that with this method, you want a fondant that's got a little bit of stretch to it. I find that fondants that have a little bit of stretch to it blend really well, and this is going to help get rid of the seams around the cake. I've then got some corn flour for dusting. I've got my paddle smoothers, and I've also got some flexi smoothers. I've got my craft knife, or you just want quite a sharp knife, my pizza cutter, my rolling pin, and I've also got some boiling water and my offset spatula, along with a paintbrush. So I've taken my cake out of the fridge and that ganache has firmed up. Now I'm going to take my boiling water and my offset spatula and just take off any excess water, run that over the top, and this is just going to melt the surface of that ganache just so our fondant will stick. I'm then going to go in and just do exactly the same thing, so just lightly running it down that side, just so the cake becomes tacky. You then want to take just a small ball of that fondant. We want to roll out enough that it's going to cover the top of our cake. So at this stage, we're just covering the top, not the sides. Now I'm going to put down some corn flour just to help stop that sticking, and I'm going to roll this out until it's around 3 to 4 millimeters in thickness. I'm then going to bring back in my cake and just lay this over the top. I can then go in with my paddle smoother and just push that onto my cake. You then want to take your craft knife, and I'm going to start by cutting in until I hit the edge, and then run that craft knife around, just cutting off the excess. Now, in order to measure out your panel, what you can do is just use a ribbon or a flexible tape measure. So I'm just going to measure around the top of my cake so I get a rough circumference and a rough height. So I'm going to start to roll out my fondant. I'm just going to keep putting that in until it's the same thickness as the top, so around 3 to 4 millimeters. I'm then going to run it over the top with my paddle smoother just to get out any marks to start with. And just so I'm not taking a lot of excess, I'm going to trim that down and trim a line along the bottom. You then want to take your rolling pin. If you do have quite a large rolling pin, you could always grab a slightly smaller one, as we want to roll this up. So we want to do it really loosely, as we don't want it sticking to itself, making sure that the bottom stays in line. I'm then going to pick up my fondant and place this against my cake, just unraveling it as I rotate my turntable round. We just want to stick that against the cake as we go. Now we've got our two pieces which are meeting, and we want to join these together as perfectly as we can. So I'm going to take my craft knife and I'm going to cut down through both pieces. I can then peel this piece back and remove that excess piece before pushing that together. So this is going to be the seam that we need to get rid of. We then need to take off the excess on the top. Now before we do this, I want to make sure the two pieces are well stuck together. So I'm just going to take some of that water and just run that around that top edge. You can go in with your paddle smoother and just push those together. I'm then going to use my craft knife, and just like I did on the top, I'm going to cut in and just run along, just taking off the excess. I'm then going to go in first with my paddle smoothers. So I'm just going to run around the side. Now if you're finding that that seam isn't disappearing, one thing you can do is just really lightly go down, just pinching that fondant together with your fingers before going back in with that paddle smoother and your flexi smoothers. Now another tip, if you're finding that your paddle smoothers and your flexi smoothers just aren't getting rid of that seam, is you can take a bit of your leftover fondant and just buff that into that join. We're then going to work on the top. So I'm going to take one of my paddle smoothers on the side, and my top one I'm just going to butt up against that. I'm then going to work in little motions, just going backwards and forwards. You want to work just around 1 inch at a time, blending that top edge together before moving the cake round and just carrying on. Now when smoothing out my cakes, I do like to remove them from my turntable, and I've just popped this one on a non-slip mat. So all we're doing is applying slight pressure to the side and also the top, forcing that fondant into the right angle of our paddle smoothers. If at any time you feel like you need more fondant around the edge, just to work into that right angle, you can just take your paddle smoother and just brush it up. Just gonna bring that fondant up. Once you're happy that that join is starting to disappear, I'm going to go in with my flexi smoothers. So these are just flexible pieces of plastic which really allow us to go in and just really define that edge. So I've got one that's got a curved edge and one that's more of a rectangle. So I'm going to use the rectangle on the side and just push the curved edge up to that. I'm then going to do the same motion as I did before, just going backwards and forwards, just applying a small amount of pressure. Now with this method, I've never found the join to 100% disappear. It's always going to be there, but the more work you put in, the fainter it's going to get. And I think if you wasn't actually looking for that join, you really wouldn't notice. Now, if you're wondering about the colour, I absolutely love this colour pink. I used some raspberry and I mixed in a little bit of ivory and some blue just to get this really pretty dusky pink colour. I'm then going to go around the side just one final time. If you do have any excess at the bottom, you can just go in with your pizza cutter and just cut around that bottom edge. One thing I always like to do with fondant cakes is, if I have time, leave them for a few hours to allow that fondant to firm up. This is really going to help when transferring over your cake, so you're not going to dig your spatula in as you move it across. So there we have the finished cake covered in fondant using the paneling method. I really hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial and will be able to use this technique on your own cakes. If you have enjoyed the video, please don't forget to give it a like, and if you haven't already, then don't forget you can subscribe to the Cakes by Nan's YouTube channel for more videos like this. So until next time, bye!